What's poppin', people? It's Dante. Today I'm going to be breaking down 5 of my street photography shots, explaining the behind the scenes of how the photographs were made. And so without further ado, let's jump right into the video. So here we have my first photograph from Baltimore of some men playing basketball. Essentially, I was drawn into this scene because of the beautiful pool of light during the golden hour as it casts long looming shadows and adds a dramatic effect. I was interested in the mural in the background and relating the basketball players to that backdrop to create a strong frame. And so ultimately, I believe the photographer is simply responsible for where they position their physical body in relationship to the moment, to the content, and the background. And in order to create a strong street photograph, one must synthesize content with form, the moment with the compositional elements that make a strong and impactful visual image. And so by using the light, by using the shadow play, by using the mural in this frame, I was able to create a more dramatic photograph. And so essentially what I was drawn into initially was this backdrop. As I highlight here in yellow, you can see I set my stage. And so by using that backdrop and separating the subjects from the background, I was able to create a strong visually impactful photograph because of that separation, where I look to set a stage so that there isn't so much clutter in my frame, where I can simplify a complex moment through the formal element of composition. Of course, positioning myself in relationship to these players was a very simple decision as the action is on the court. And so by placing the subject in the center of my frame, I was able to create that impact initially. However, the moment when these arms that I'm highlighting in green here outstretched behind this man in the foreground was out of my control. And so actually I was photographing using program mode at this scene. I had my shutter speed around 1/4000th of a second in the result of the image as I was using the automatic function. And so this was a very quick moment. This was something that I couldn't perceive with my 2 eyes. However, by being there and being prepared to press the shutter and following through by working the scene, I was able to put order to the chaos here, where the man in the background with his face looking up towards the ball has a very dramatic effect due to the way the light casts a shadow across the half of his face in relationship to the moment of him looking up to that basketball, which is a very beautiful, decisive moment. And in the background, of course, we have a few different people here. We have this man covering his face from the sunlight, and this man here on the right-hand side looking towards the foreground of the frame. And so one of the elements in this picture that I believe came through spontaneity, serendipity, and simply luck and chance was the background elements of the shadow play here on the left-hand side in relationship to the mural of the children playing basketball. And so as you can see here, as I draw in white on the frame, you can see me drawing these arrows around that mural, around that shadow play, and the way in which it relates to the foreground element of this basketball in the boy's hand. Now, these elements are very much difficult to put order to within a composition. These kind of things that are complex and, relating these different small details and foreground elements to background elements are very difficult to pull off in a photograph. But once again, what I want to emphasize with this frame is I simply walked past a school, looked at a pool of light. I saw some children playing, I saw a beautiful mural, and I approached this scene. As I approached the scene, I began to chat with the young men and asked if I could make some photographs. As I had permission to make some photographs, I positioned myself in various ways. I moved my body around so that I can relate the different elements within my frame that initially triggered me to press the shutter, that being the light and the mural. And so by understanding these two relationships that I could make, I then positioned myself in a way that synthesized the moment, the content with the formal elements of composition. And as complex as the photograph may seem, it was actually simple as these decisions I made intuitively by approaching the scene initially. And so here we have my grandmother sunbathing on the rooftop in Philadelphia. And what I want to emphasize here is that you can make street photographs of anyone and everyone. I think that photographing your family is a great way to get close and make more intimate photographs, and photographs that I honestly like more than others because of that fact. And so here we have the strong gesture that triggered me to make the frame. We have the beautiful lipstick. We have the nails, the red color there that sort of draws your eye in the frame. But what I want to emphasize with this photograph is the fact that I dropped to a low angle in relationship to the background to separate that gesture from the different elements within the frame to simplify my composition and to create a visual feast where the frame is now filled, and about 1/4 of the frame is filled with this element that I highlighted in red, that being the gesture of my grandmother on the rooftop. And so the other elements within the frame fell together naturally. We have the background that's separated from these skyscrapers. We have the fence. We have this beautiful cloud here. And then, of course, on the right-hand side, this beautiful popping yellow color of the shirt and the gesture of the hand in relationship to these other subjects on the middle ground or the background of the frame. And so these different elements came together naturally through a very simple compositional decision. Dropping to a low angle, physically positioning myself as close as possible to a gesture, to a moment, and then separating that from the background. And then so when you look at the composition, it's actually extremely simple. As we break the frame up in a very particular way, where about 1/4 of the frame is filled with that gesture. And so when you take away the rest of the frame, you can see how impactful that moment was. And you can see how important it was for me to position my camera as close as possible to that subject. And so here at the front lines of conflict between Israel and Palestine at the border of Jericho, I photographed this masked, tattered man. And this photograph came through me returning to the same location over and over again, where I had permission to photograph these men at the conflict scenes. And I had the ability to get as close as possible because I mustered up the courage and I had the opportunity to make this photograph. And so this came through me being very courageous and very patient by going back to the same community over and over again. And actually, as I approached this scene, the border was covered with police and army, and the fire was rising, and I wasn't permitted to enter into Jericho. However, by entering into a Palestinian taxi and having him drive me as close to the border and checkpoint as possible, I was able to run through the desert and position myself onto the front lines to make this photograph. And so a risk was made here. And so here we have a very simple composition, breaking it up with the rule of thirds. And once again, the thing that I did to make this photograph much more impactful was very simple. I very much was interested in the subject of the man with the tattered mask. And so to break this composition up, similar to me composing at the scene of my grandmother on the rooftop, I positioned my camera as physically close as possible to that subject on the right-hand side. And so when you break the composition up, once again, I want to draw this so that you can see how impactful and simple this moment is. Half of the frame this time is filled with the main subject. And so by positioning your body as close as possible to a subject, by filling your foreground with something visually interesting or emotionally impactful, the rest of the frame kind of just naturally falls into place. And so that's a similar technique that I do. Hopefully my audio is still good. I just clicked on something weird on my iPad. But here at the scene in Napoli, I wound up making a photograph of these men engaged with watermelon at the scene, filling the foreground of my frame once again with 1/3 of the composition being that man on the right-hand side. However, the difference between the way in which I composed at this particular scene was making sure I emphasized that man that is swimming in the ocean there in the background. And so after about 2 hours of spending time at this scene, getting to know the people, chatting, swimming, and enjoying the day, I was able to make this frame. And so as they took the watermelon out from the sea, I was there and prepared with my camera to photograph as they opened up the watermelon and shared it amongst their friends and me. And so at this scene, I was using that swimmer as my anchor point, making sure that I position my physical body in relationship to that anchor point, to the background, in order to put together this frame. And so what that means is without that swimmer, this frame would fall flat. But because I was trying to adjust my composition in relationship to that swimmer, everything else naturally fell into place. And so you can see here this man in the foreground fills up 1/3 of the frame. You can see this man here on the left-hand side fills up another 1/3 of the frame. And then finally, we have the beautiful watermelon that pops out here. And then we have this visual feast formed by filling the frame with all of this visual interest of the watermelon, of the gestures, of the people. And you have this spiral composition that sort of draws your eye around the composition. And so this came through me being patient. This came through me spending time. And so once again, to work the scene is very important and critical in my process, and is how I came home with a lot of these photographs that are visually impactful and emotionally engaging. It's through me actually being there and being present, where I'm not only physically close to the subjects, but I'm emotionally close. I'm connected to the scene. I spent time to create these stories and to create these frames. And so I encourage you too to spend time at a scene and to be patient and observant and allow the moments to sort of unfold naturally. Where here at this scene in Zambia, Africa, I observed many different funerals, and it was actually permitted for me to make photographs here because I spent so much time as a Peace Corps volunteer in this particular village. And as the funeral procession proceeded, I was very interested in the moment of them digging the grave and putting the grave underground, as there was this drama at the scene of people mourning and the smoke was rising and the dirt was everywhere. And so I was able to make this photograph relating the man in the foreground to the background by scanning his movements and observing his gesture and dropping to his angle and dropping low to fill the foreground of the frame with that emotional impact. But similar to the way in which I framed the photograph at the basketball scene in Baltimore, we have these interesting relationships here in the middle ground of the frame of these arms and the way that they're outstretched and create this strong gesture in relationship to the background element of the crowd watching in the back. So there's the very sort of simple technique I use time and time again by essentially looking for something emotionally or visually impactful and then positioning my physical body in relationship to that thing or that moment or that gesture. And so by dropping low towards the man in the foreground who was mourning, I was able to naturally put together the rest of the frame. And again, this is a physical game. Photography, it's not necessarily a visual game of you just, looking at leading lines and compositions, but you're looking at life itself and you're physically responding by dropping low, by moving right, by moving left, and making these relationships intuitively. And then the different elements sort of fall together naturally, like this interesting moment I find between this stick that is jutting out from the left-hand side and this pole here on the right-hand side. And we have this sort of relationship between these different poles, between these different elements, these sticks that I believe come together through that intuitive nature of making a photograph. And so finally, we have this scene here from Mumbai, India at Bandra Fort, where I was photographing at this beautiful scene, setting my stage. And so once again, using the technique of looking for a beautiful background, right? Similar to me looking at that beautiful background in Baltimore. However, the thing that I did here differently was emphasizing the choke point. And that choke point being what I just highlighted in blue, positioning my physical body in relationship to that man within the window frame to create this composition. And so actually at this scene, I was drawn in because of the shape and the form and the elements that I could combine through the geometry and the formal elements of composition due to the way that these window frames and this doorway was breaking up the composition. However, I recognized that it was possible to make a photograph of the bird in flight as I recognized the patterns of nature. I recognized the patterns of the light and the way it was casted upon the scene. I recognized the birds in flight and the way that they flew across the frame. And so I was there and I was patient, observing human behavior, observing the patterns of the people and the way that position themselves here in the foreground, making photographs as tourists. And so it was very simple for me to actually come home with this decisive moment of the bird. As I remained patient, I remained observant, and I positioned my physical body in relationship to these elements to create this composition. And so as complex and lucky and out of control these frames may seem, I'm trying to break down them in a very simple way for you to understand how they were made and how hopefully you can use some of these techniques to go out there and to make your own street photographs. And so hopefully at the end of the day, we came home with a couple of different simple ideas of how I work the scene, how I make photographs, and how I see the world, and how you can apply some of these techniques to create more impactful street photographs. And so with that being said, thank you for watching today's rapid fire video breaking down 5 of my photographs across the world. Hope you learned something today. If not, became entertained in some capacity. And I will see you in the next video. Peace.